Hello everyone, and welcome to the webinar, Designing and Sustaining Teams to Support Change Efforts. Some introductions real quick. With more than 20 years of experience in child welfare at the local, state, and national levels, Tori Russell's work has been concentrated in the areas of capacity building, continuous quality improvement, intervention development and implementation, and building evidence in child welfare. With more than 30 years of experience in working with state child welfare systems, Joan Nelson Phillips is a CQI and practice improvement expert consultant. With more than 25 years of public and private sector child welfare experience, Will Hornsby's work has been focused on implementation science principles, systematic problem-solving approaches, and assisting state and local agencies in monitoring their child welfare programs. With experience working with states, tribes, and territories in Region 10, Juliana Ormsby's work focuses on implementation design and change management support, project management and technical assistance, providing strategic consultation, and enhancing collaboration between child welfare systems. I'll now turn it over to Tori Russell to get started.
Great, thanks, Chris. So today our agenda for this teaming session is really obviously focused on teaming, but not just teaming, focused on teaming for the change and implementation process. So teaming for implementation is a bit different than just our general everyday teaming, and we're going to talk about that. We're also going to talk about the core principles of this type of teaming. We're going to focus a little bit on charters and communication plans and really how to work together to use these teams to guide change efforts. We'll talk a little bit about missteps and strategies to prevent them, and then we're going to have some facilitated breakouts so that you guys have an opportunity to talk with each other about the information we've presented to you. So our objectives today are pretty straightforward. We're going to make sure that we identify for you the 6 essential functions in the Center for State's Teaming Approach. We're going to make sure that you have an understanding of how to select the right team members and teaming structures for the different steps in the change process. We'll talk about identifying strategies to build effective internal and external communication plans. We'll focus on barriers and how to overcome them, and then again, connecting with peers.
Teaming for Change and Implementation diagram shows a ring of circles. The green outer circle is labeled Readiness. The blue inner circle has 6 lines extending from the outer edge. There are 3 lines on each side of the circle. All contain text that reads, from the left side to the right side, monitoring, evaluating, and applying findings, intervention testing, piloting, and staging, and implementation, planning, and capacity building. Then, problem exploration, theory of change, and intervention selection and design adaptation. The orange circle in the middle of the blue circle is labeled teaming. The innermost white circle is labeled effective implementation.
So, as many of you know, you've been a part of this teaming, this change and implementation process before, other sessions where we've talked about the different steps in the change and implementation process. So today we're talking about teaming as part of this process. And as you can see from this graphic here, we've already done presentations and sessions on problem exploration, and we have a brief that's available publicly for exploring problems and identifying root causes. We've focused on theory of change, and we've done some sessions on that, and we have, again, a brief about theory of change ready for you to review. That's a public document. Today we're talking about teaming as part of this implementation process. And as you can see, with problem exploration and theory of change, we've identified them as particular steps in the process. But with teaming, This goes through every step in the process, and that's why when we talk about teaming for change and implementation, we talk a lot about how to set up your team at the beginning, but then also how to review your team and make sure your team is achieving exactly what you want that team to achieve throughout the process of implementation. Thinking about the essential functions of teaming, at the center in the brief that we've developed and that we've also made public for you, I think it's also in, is it available up in a pod, Nicole? I think it might be available for you to download. If not, it's available on our website. So as we've developed the brief related to teaming, we've identified 6 different essential functions related to the teaming process. The first is identifying the team purpose, making sure you understand the purpose, identify the team members and the teaming structure, developing a team charter, developing a communication plan and an external communication strategy, guiding the change process, so using that team to guide change, and then analyzing results and changing your team as necessary and repeating these steps as necessary. So we're going to move into a polling question now, just to get us started and to see who we have on the line. So here's our first question. Has your agency used a structured process like this before to build and guide a team to manage a change effort? And if so, were you successful? And give us a little bit of information about that. You feel free to type here in the chat. So as the answers are coming in, it looks like we've got about almost half and half, or a little under half and half. Because really when we're thinking about the teaming process, again, we're talking about teaming to develop and implement change in an agency and organization. And so that may be different than other change initiatives that you might have been part of at your agency.
Final results of the polling question. Has your agency used a structured process like this before to build and guide a team to manage change efforts? 58.3% answered yes, 41.6% answered no.
So we got some of the answers. We were moderately successful when we rolled out our differential response system. We thought the process went smoothly, but our stakeholders indicated that they wanted more information than we provided. Okay, that's good. That's definitely a very common challenge. Successful is always a work in progress if you're doing it right, for sure, because you're always taking a look at who's on your team and who you need and whether or not you're achieving the things you want to be achieving. Somewhat specific roles and responsibilities were challenging for sure, and a lot of the time people don't want to nail down the roles and responsibilities first thing, so that gets challenging. Okay, a few more polling questions here. What challenges have you encountered in building and sustaining teams to manage change efforts? So again, this is you guys writing in here. You've already mentioned a few of the challenges that you've had, but right here in the chat, any other challenges than what we've already talked about? And if you haven't used something like this, what barriers might you anticipate for working through this process? So challenges, keeping members engaged and committed, yep. Keeping momentum going, for sure. Challenge in aligning to a common goal, definitely. Significant changes in leadership and leadership direction, priorities. Leadership is a huge issue when you're thinking about teaming in your teaming process. Maintaining momentum, staff turnover, aligning to, yes, all these things, good. Yeah, engaging the stakeholders that you need to engage, that is definitely a barrier that you might come up against if you're trying to do this work. Because stakeholders outside of your agency and organization are important to involve in the work. We all know that, but it doesn't make it any easier. Okay, this is really good. These are really, really good answers, and I think we're all on the same page. This is very challenging stuff. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Joan Nelson Phillips, and she's going to dig right into a teaming scenario.
Thanks, everybody. I'm hoping you can hear me well. So as many of you, just based on what you've just all kind of thrown in here, as many of you have just shared, we've all had our own experiences with serving on teams. And so challenges are obviously pretty common. And, you know, some examples, I think, in addition to what you guys have just talked about, can include just being on an established team, like already being a member of a team where you kind of feel like everybody's got a defined role, and then somehow there's just a change. It can be a pretty big one, and maybe it's a change in leadership, and maybe you've got a new member all of a sudden that's a key decision maker in the agency that wants to take the group in a slightly different direction. It can be a change in legislation that can lead maybe to a slowdown or even a halt in the work that the team was engaged in. And sometimes it can just even generate a change in direction in terms of where the team was going. I think another common barrier or challenge that teams face, and I'm wondering if many, if not most of you on the line today are going to relate to this, because I think sometimes when teams are established at the very beginning, at least this has been my experience, that we tend to want to go to a comfortable place, to a familiar group of people who are going to be good partners and do the work. And we're kind of referring to them today maybe as the usual suspects on a team. And I suspect that many of you, because I know some of you probably fit this definition. And so, you know, we are, you know, if you're kind of perceived as being competent, you've been on teams before, they know your work ethic, and you probably get stretched thin because you get pulled into a lot of these teams anyway. And so you're doing more of this work than expected. And then sometimes you've got stakeholders who are just also familiar. It can be a private agency partner who maybe you kind of already know what their perspective is, and so you know you can count on them to kind of be in line with wherever the team is going to go. So, you know, when you do that, sometimes what it does is it excludes bringing other people onto a team, to thinking outside the box a little bit. And that's why we kind of are referring to this group of individuals as maybe the usual suspects, kind of that group of people. It's not a bad thing, but it sometimes prevents getting newer voices to the table. And so even though there are other barriers, and you guys have talked about some of them already, it's just important that when you think about having access to maybe a more structured approach to teaming, which is what we're talking about today, having information that kind of helps guide your agency in anticipating and being able to navigate challenges like this, and maybe even mitigate it a little bit, can be a good thing. And so that's why we just wanted to put a few of those examples out there for you. So let's take a minute or two to maybe consider the purpose of an implementation team, and specifically, what are some of the common drivers that lead an agency to develop, to put in place an actual implementation team. You know, an implementation team, when you think about some of these drivers, it could include some of the things you're looking at up here on the screen. It can be in response to a CFSR report. You've got to develop a PIP. I know most people would be familiar with that that's on the line today. It could be maybe some new state legislation that's going to have some major impacts on practice. Maybe a lawsuit that's stemming from a highly publicized case event, a new policy initiative, maybe some broader systemic efforts that the agency wants to be engaged in to improve their CQI process, or something everybody, again, would probably be familiar with on the line today, which is just developing and implementing a really good, thorough, successful child and family services plan. So Tori was talking earlier about the teaming brief that you should be able to access through this call today, download it. So for those, some of you, I'm hoping have had the chance to read through it, but the teaming brief actually provides the definition of an implementation team, and it's defined as kind of a team or a set of teams that are representative of diverse expertise and perspectives from across the organization and its stakeholder groups that performs the work of implementing change within an organization. Some of the team roles might include developing, supporting, and overseeing the implementation plan. Another role might be being a champion of the change effort and being available to secure the necessary resources for it. Being able to address implementation barriers effectively, and also looking for opportunities along the way, and using data, which I know is important to all the work that we're doing, to actually monitor progress and then be able to make informed decisions to ensure that the change initiative is going to be successful. So teams can be formed, I'm sure, as we all know, at any point really in the change and implementation process. But while that kind of core steering team, and we'll talk more about this as we go through the conversation today, while that core steering team really needs to come together at the beginning of the process in order to guide the work and be able to make some of those critical decisions regarding who's going to be on the team, what the teaming structure is going to be. Sub-teams or work groups can actually be formed as needed throughout the change and implementation process. So I'm imagining that our collective experience would tell us that there's some key considerations that really help agencies, us, in kind of building a sound implementation team, kind of pulling one together. So one really important early step is to identify the type of tasks that are going to be necessary for implementation, and then what are the skills and the knowledge and the input that's going to be needed in order to accomplish those tasks before deciding on the team members, the team structure, the roles, and the actual size of the teams that are going to be needed. So in thinking about kind of team membership, teams are really going to benefit from having individuals on board that have experience in really essential areas, such as those that have some expertise in problem identification. I'm sure all of us are anxious about just making sure we've got people that bring some experience with doing deeper problem exploration. This includes root cause analysis. If you're engaged in a PIP, you know how important that is. Theory of change development, the ability to be able to conduct real research and identify possible interventions or solutions. You also want to have people that have just knowledge of basic data collection, analysis, and use of data, especially around like using data for fidelity purposes around your intervention. And you want to have people on the team that have those type of skill sets on the team as early as possible. Individuals that have knowledge or experience with creating and managing just broad organizational and system change. Sometimes it's going to just be really good program managers. People who carry influence within your agency, within your system. They actually have credible relationships internally with staff and with external stakeholders, and they bring good communication skills to the table. People that have knowledge or expertise with the actual intervention that your change initiative is focused on and is planning to implement. And then finally, individuals that do carry some of that decision-making authority, so you can actually make some decisions. They carry that, they bring that into the team, and it's able to sustain the intervention over time. So identifying the team's purpose is also a really critical first step in the teaming process. In doing so, it helps provide a clear understanding for everybody of the need for the team, the reason behind it, forming the team in terms of, just making sure that all team members are clear on that. And it also helps to clarify agency leadership expectations for the team and what the role is going to be within the organizational structure. So when identifying the team's purpose, and you can kind of see these on the screen here, it's just helpful to be able to be sure that you can answer the following questions, the ones that are up here. So what's the problem or problems that the team is going to be addressing? What is the goal or outcome the team needs to achieve? How are the teams going to be aligned within the agency's broader organizational structure? And then is it going to be a single team, or is it going to be multiple teams that are going to be needed at that initial stage of the process? So I know this is a lot of information, and we're going to have the opportunity in our breakout groups to kind of talk about this and process it a little bit more. But with that, I'm going to turn it over to Will. He's going to talk a little bit more about team membership.
Identifying team members Venn diagram features the word team in the middle, surrounded by 3 overlapping circles which read variety of organizational levels and roles, variety of perspectives, and variety of skills.
Okay, let's talk about identifying team members. The most effective teams bring together a variety of agency personnel and both internal and external stakeholders with different roles, talent, perspectives, and skill sets. Diverse team members bring a variety of ideas, multiple perspectives, and help agencies consider a wide range of outcomes or impacts of an initiative. And when we think about internal staff, having diverse internal staff promotes staff engagement and buy-in, allows the team to benefit from diverse knowledge and expertise, and increases the likelihood of implementation fidelity within the staff of the organization. And then diverse external stakeholders, such as families, youth, courts, tribes, service providers, other partners, having diverse representation from that end helps to build community responsiveness to the initiative. That goes to some of the challenges that were identified earlier by some of the participants. Facilitates community buy-in for the initiative. And team size is an important consideration when forming a team. Since both large and small teams have advantages, really, this is one of the areas where the size of the team is less important than ensuring that you've got the right people on the team to move the work forward. You want the team to be large enough to include the important perspectives, but small enough to still try to collaborate effectively. Size of the team is going to be dependent on the needs of the team and the initiative. What does it take to get all of the expertise and the stakeholders needed, as Joan was talking about, some of the different expertise to be able to have a effective team. And that core steering team typically will have approximately 5 to 7 members who have the appropriate decision-making authority and oversight of the major functions of the sub-team. Now, let's consider a relevant example in regards to building a team for the Child and Family Services Plan. For CFSP planning and development, team membership is really dependent upon what the data indicates are the issues and the partners that would be connected to help address those issues in some way. There are some core stakeholders to always consider having at the table: parents and youth, courts, tribal representatives when relevant, and child serving agencies that you work with frequently, thinking about behavioral health, substance abuse, domestic violence providers. But there are some non-traditional partners to invite depending on what the data is telling you. For example, if focusing on prevention or early years under 5, you may want to consider child care agencies that have prevention grants, such as home visiting programs, teen pregnancy prevention, typically health departments, or the hospital, CDCAP partners. Another example is involved in the Department of Education for children and youth in care that are school age. Some states are developing data sharing agreements between education and child welfare in order to track student progress for kids in care in the school system. We want to keep children in their schools of origin. When entering care, the education system can be an ally and provide information about how best to do that. Another example is involving public health Medicaid providers. We know that data shows that there's struggles in meeting medical and dental health checks for kids in care. Working with the public health system allows child welfare to identify strategies, to try to close possible provider gaps in the community around these areas. You may see trends in data that shows increased numbers of moms in prison, could be entry or exit. For example, you may have moms that are reentering the community and reunited with their children as they leave prison. If you're needing to address this issue, then having someone from the Department of Corrections would make sense to include on the team to make sure there's an understanding of that system and to help the team work through challenges and possible approaches to moving forward. And we all need to consider the Children's Bureau's encouragement that the CFSP be used by states as an opportunity to create a blueprint for a prevention-focused vision that may necessitate new non-traditional partnerships. So it is challenging to be intentional about team members, and there can be some challenges because some partners expect to be at the table regardless of what the issue is being addressed, and historically they may have always been invited. It's necessary to look at what is the data saying, what are the issues, and who needs to be at the table to provide their expertise to be able to move the work forward and to get the work completed. Now, it's helpful to think about team members in the following 3 roles, and that all teams and sub-teams have members that fill these roles. And I invite you to just kind of think about how you, the role that you play and how you participate in teams or sub-teams that you may be a part of. The first C is for collaborators. These team members are indispensable to the process and have decision-making authority related to the work of change and implementation. So thinking about core steering team leads, sub-team leads. The second C is cooperators. These team members provide input as stakeholders, but may not have a final say in work or decisions. Thinking about sub-team participants, community members, core steering team members in a consultation role, such as general counsel. And the third C is coordinators. These team members ensure that the work and events do not duplicate or overlap with each other or similar related efforts, and provide organizational support. They're also crucial in facilitating communication linkages, thinking about project managers, sub-team leads, system partners.
The example shows a box at the top of the page labeled Executive Leadership Committee, Agency Director and other leadership and decision makers to address adaptive and technical challenges. An arrow to the left of the box points down to a box that reads CFSR Advisory Committee, Agency Director, Innovation Expert, Court Representative, Mental Health Provider Representative, Substance Abuse Provider Representative, Nonprofit Providers, Private Service Providers, State Legislature Representative, Parent Representative, Youth Representative. An arrow to the right of the top box points down to another box that reads Core Steering Team, Project Manager, Human Resources Manager, Data Lead, CQI Manager, Training Director, Policy Lead, Practice Area Managers, General Counsel, Child Welfare Information Systems Lead, Supervisor Representative, Frontline Workforce Representative, Parent Representative, Communications Lead. Arrows in the middle of the two bottom boxes point up from those boxes to the Executive Leadership Committee box.
So as we know, there's no single correct way to create a teaming structure. The most effective ones are when we're leveraging an agency's culture and building from its existing structures and processes. A clear teaming structure clearly defines roles and responsibilities of all the team and the team members. It encourages collaboration and flexibility. It's important to be aware and acknowledge any gaps in the teaming structure, and then having the willingness to address the gaps. It's essential to be aware of resources and internal capacity to meet the needs in order to staff the teaming structure. And this takes time. It requires thoughtfulness. It requires, effort and a methodical approach, and this not being a last-minute thing or something that you're not putting effort to. All teams and sub-teams should follow a similar process to determine purpose, members, structure, and communication. And as we're moving through the change process, team formation should be revisited, and the composition and goals of a team may evolve, or additional teams may be formed or necessary. An example teaming structure for a CFSP team is shown on the slide. This will look similar to the example that's shown in the brief, with a couple of minor exceptions. Some jurisdictions will have similar structures with different team names. It's recommended that for long-term change initiatives, such as a CFSP, that a member of the supervisory staff and frontline workforce are included in the core steering team to bring that voice and those voices to the table for the decision-making process of a long-term strategic planning effort. So at this point, I'm going to turn things over to Tori and Juliana.
Thanks, Will. So I think the purpose of this next bit is for Juliana and I to talk a little bit about our experiences with building and sustaining teams for change and implementation work. And so one of the things that we wanted to talk about is we wanted to talk about examples of jurisdictions where we've worked, where we've had some challenges with teaming and trying to build a teaming structure for a change initiative. My perspective from my position, and I'm not sure if you feel the same way about this, Juliana, is that it's always a challenge, especially if a jurisdiction has a teaming structure in place and it's a more general teaming structure, but they're focusing on a specific change initiative, and we have to move and change some things around within the team to focus it specifically on achieving the goals of that change initiative. But Juliana, I wanted to give you a chance to comment on that, knowing the work that you've been doing recently very directly with states.
Yeah, thanks, Tori. And I would echo what you just said as well, too. I think in my experience, I've really supported a number of states, tribes, and territories kind of across the spectrum of building and sustaining teams, from initiating teaming structures for a brand new project to helping jurisdictions troubleshoot or assess existing teaming structure to kind of realign with their implementation goals or changing project needs. I think some of the issues I've run into, and I know some of these may have been touched on and we'll get into more depth later, but I think one of the challenges I've experienced is kind of this idea of going slow to go fast, or slowing down to go fast. I think jurisdictions, rightfully so, get really excited and even anxious about working on systems change, and sometimes it's hard to not jump right into trying to solve the issue and planning the work, because it does seem like this is time consuming, but it really is, I've found through experience it's worth the effort to really slow down and focus on that, because you will likely run into issues if you don't later. But I would say too, a couple of other things, that it's so critical to know who to engage and why and when. I know we'll talk about this some more too, but I think sometimes I feel like there's a sense of an agency wanting to figure things out first at their level, or kind of, get our own house in order before bringing in partners. But I think you're missing an opportunity potentially by bringing in those stakeholders and other staff early. They might be able to provide the perspective that's missing from just the agency input. And I think it's also a really great way to create buy-in early on, right, versus maybe creating something and then having to sell it to folks later on. I would just say, too, I know Will mentioned this earlier, kind of the size of a team. There is no sort of perfect number, right? But, spending some time early on thinking about, who really needs to be on your team, even having maybe a criteria, right? Like why their participation's important. Are they really clear on what their role and responsibilities are in this team? Are they clear about how much time is needed for this work? But then also understanding there are multiple opportunities in the teaming structure for folks to participate, right? I think one area that's really underutilized in the teaming structure are the sub-teams or subgroups or subcommittees. There are different names for it. There's an opportunity for folks there. They may not be on the implementation team or have the time, but you might need their specific expertise, and they could be on sort of an ad hoc subgroup. So there are opportunities for lots of people to get engaged and not necessarily be on a really large implementation team.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. Juliana, I know that one major issue that we've talked about already a little bit, but comes up over and over again is the challenge of getting leadership on board with participating in a formal teaming structure process. And I know that this really quite often is sometimes just a timing issue, but have you had any experiences in working to try and get leadership on board and participating in some way with the work of any teaming structures you've been working with?
Yeah, I mean, I think we know sort of in theory, we get it that leadership is really important, but we also get that leadership in any agency is really busy. They have a number of competing priorities, and we know that time is a challenge. But again, it gets to sort of this initial foundational work around, staff look to leadership to provide direction, right, and really to sanction this work. They're looking to leadership to say, yes, this particular project is important in all of these projects. And so negotiating early on with leadership and the team around how leadership will participate in the process. So maybe the director will participate in the executive committee, and perhaps their deputy will be on the implementation team with clear decision-making and communication pathways articulated. So it's clear when the director needs to be involved and when others can make decisions on their own as well. So I also think it's really important, and again, I know it can be seen as time-consuming, but leadership should be engaged in developing that charter with the team so they can be there to provide input, participate in the process, and really to help model the decision-making process that you want to see for how members will be working together.
Great. Thanks, Juliana. Okay, so we'll come back to a conversation with Juliana in a little bit, but we're going to move into a polling question again. So let's pull up our polling question. So it looks like we've already answered this question. The first question I think we've answered, but now that you've heard a little bit of information from the presentation, you can think about, in your experience, what the biggest challenges have been for you in developing teaming structures in your experience. And then the second question is, what is the biggest challenge for you in your experience in identifying and engaging the right members needed on the team to do the work? You guys can type into the little chat boxes here up on the screen, and we'll have a quick conversation about your answers. Yeah, I think getting the right people on the team with the right skills to do the work, this is especially true if you're trying to do anything data related. anything related to very specific practices. You have to get people on the team that have the skills to analyze the data. You have to get people on the team that have an understanding of the practice that you're trying to change. The diversity of voices, getting diversity of voices early, ensuring that team members have some foundational understanding of CQI concepts. Right, if we're going to be using this type of process, that's really a problem-solving approach using data, and CQI is a really important part of this work, then everybody needs to understand it, or else the team is going to get very stuck very early on. The bottom here, getting stakeholders engaged and sustaining their engagement, engaging team members when some members want to maintain silos, yes. Getting leadership buy-in and being willing to go through the process, take the time and the necessary steps to get the team identified and in place. Yeah, these are all very good answers to these questions, and I think very consistent with the experiences that we've had. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on to the next slide. I'm going to turn it over to Will, and we'll move into the next section of the conversation. Will?
So now we're going to talk a little bit about team charters. Team charters are comprehensive documents that outline mission, goals, and objectives for the team, scope, boundaries, and timeframes for the team's work. What are the team deliverables? What's the decision-making authority and the policies? The role of the agency leadership on the team, communication methods and reporting structures, clear and specific team member roles and responsibilities, and a plan to mitigate team conflict. So on the slide, you can see some of the benefits of having a formal team charter, establishing accountability and setting expectations, conveying the importance of the work of the team within the agency, supporting member engagement and empowerment, and then especially thinking about our field, the child welfare field, thinking about turnover, serving as a tool for onboarding new team members. So, not only those times when we're needing to expand or evolve the team, but those times when there's unexpected changes, having a solid charter in place really helps to move things forward at that point. Want people to be aware that there's a link to a team charter template in the teaming brief that you may want to use in the future. So want to take a minute here to talk a little bit about communication. This has been identified by you as we were talking about some of the challenges and barriers. Clear and effective communication is critical to the success of any team. Having a communication plan, it will establish how the sub-teams will communicate, who will be responsible for sending the right information to the right people, how often communication will happen, how feedback will be gathered, how the team will be positioned in the agency to facilitate communication and decisions. And effective communication plans ensure the flow of information to leadership among the sub-teams and across the agency, clarifies internal and external communication protocols and who's responsible for them, provide relevant information to all stakeholders so they have an opportunity to offer feedback, and trying to purposely force the team to think about different communication methods, in-person, virtual meetings, presentations, emails, written documents, just thinking about what are the different ways that we can try to communicate more effectively. Now, in the teaming brief, the 5 W's are outlined, and this will help the team clarify the important points of a communication plan and external communication strategy. So who needs to know what? Is it relevant to their role? Why or why not? What do they need to know? You know, knowing how much to share is important. Knowing what's appropriate to share with whom is essential. Where having an easily accessible way of accessing and sharing information helps to keep everyone informed and in the loop, particularly thinking about working with external partners and how to share information effectively. When we all know this, we all get so much information, and it's important to make sure that members know when to expect communication, stick to those time frames, try to have the right information at the right time, and then why, making sure that information being shared is meaningful and relevant. And it's very important to recognize the difference between internal team communication and external stakeholder communication. Communication with external stakeholders may be more formal, might include presentations, written reports, memos, in-person meetings. So just real quickly, let's consider the need for a formal charter and communication plan in the context of a CFSP teaming structure. To be efficient when there's little time for planning and development, and we all know this, often states will hold a large-scale strategic planning meeting. While this can be effective, you know, let's consider if there were efforts to develop a teaming structure, communication plan, identifying leads from that large-scale meeting as a critical way to kind of keep the stakeholders engaged and to use that opportunity as a way to move forward a teaming structure. It's also critical in the CFSP teaming process to identify a dedicated communications lead or a project coordinator to pull together information, hold team members accountable, and keep them engaged and operational according to the communication protocol. And lastly, it's important to clearly define the information sharing protocols and to follow up with all external stakeholders to ensure that communication loops are staying intact. So with that, I'm going to turn things back over to Tori.
Thanks, Will. Okay. So let's talk to Juliana again. And Juliana, are you there?
Yep, I'm here.
Excellent. So tell us a little bit about your experience in developing team charters. And is there any specific strategy that you might recommend for jurisdictions to get past the formality of a charter? I know they can often be pretty lengthy formal documents that sometimes seem pretty overwhelming. So any strategies you would recommend for that?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, when I first began building my own implementation practice knowledge, I really appreciated the design and structure of implementation science, but I did struggle with some of the formality and some of the jargon. Even the word charter, which isn't unique to implementation science, they use terms of reference. I think that's even more more formal, and I'm not sure what that is, right? And I found that jurisdictions sometimes struggle with this as well, and so I've typically called charters working agreements because really essentially that's what this is. When we talk about creating a charter, we're really talking about how we want to work together as a group and what agreements do we need to operate as a team. I think even the design of a charter document can be a barrier. It's typically done as kind of a word narrative document, and it's too formal for some agencies' cultures. I've seen some great charters that are represented visually that really reflect the spirit of the agency or community and what they're trying to accomplish with this work. So I think there's some creative ways to do a charter. I've also used a strategy where if it's a bit of a challenge to engage folks in developing the charter, I've started with where the team thinks they're doing well in those core components of the charter. They may already have a really great decision-making approach or policy in place, so we start with that, or maybe they have a solid communication plan and start there.
Excellent, thanks. All right, let's jump back over to Joan. I'm going to get over to you, Joan.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, so just real quickly, just looking at the graphic that y'all have in front of you right now, working to guide change, and this is really over time, and this gets to the fact that any team that you're, especially if we're talking about a long-term process, which a lot of the work that we're involved in doesn't take place over a couple of months, takes place, unfortunately, over the course of many years, and so the teams are going to be changing, and the areas of focus are going to be changing as well. But it's really important when you kind of look from left to right here, not that it has to go in sequence, but that the teams are in place throughout the change and implementation process, and that they're able to really, whoever you've got on these teams, when you think about kind of the structured approach we're talking about here, which is a little different sometimes than what we're sometimes used to, which is kind of being thrown into something and just having to have to adapt, but having a more structured, deliberate thought process about how are we going to do this, who do we need to have on board, and are we going to be able to work across all of these different function areas in the change and implementation process. So just really briefly, just kind of thinking through having a team in place that's going to be able to perform the functions around assessing your agency's readiness to even engage in the change process, whether it's just kind of in general, are we ready to go down any kind of a path like this, or more specifically, as you get closer down the road and you've identified what your intervention is going to be, do we have the people on board, the teaming structure in place to be able to do this? Having the team in place that's going to be able to better understand the problem, the identified problem that you're facing, and having the capacity to be able to use data in order to dig deeper into those root causes. A team that's going to be able to develop serious change and be able to determine, kind of pull the causal links together and determine the most effective way to get from the root cause of the problem to get to those desired long-term outcomes. Pulling kind of all the intervention pieces together, just being able to identify, research, figure out what intervention is going to be the best match to address the problem that you've got in front of you, laying the foundation so that you can have a successful implementation phase to that, and then being able to evaluate it. And sometimes it also includes piloting or staging the intervention in a way so that you can make adjustments moving forward. And most importantly, I think just being able to use data, collect it and use it effectively throughout the process to monitor progress and to be able to inform where you're going moving forward. So just moving into just the process of being able to monitor the work of the team moving forward and just making sure that the change initiative is progressing. Some of the things that you see up on the screen here, being able to have regular debriefs within the team, being able to step back a little bit and evaluate the team's work. This is really essential to determining what your next steps in the process are going to be. And some of the questions to consider during this part of the process includes whether the work of the implementation team has really been completed, and whether the deliverables or the outcomes that you guys have been seeking have been met, whether the deliverables or, again, the outcomes are actually meeting the expectations, whether there's anything about the team, anything that's changed where you kind of need to regroup for a minute to kind of figure out whether there's any changes that need to be made, especially around the team composition. So it's important to just be able to assess whether the team has any additional work related to sustaining that intervention that's been selected and is in the process of being implemented over time. And if you need to, kind of assess whether or not the current team members have the capacity and skills for whatever part in the project you're engaged in. And, I know when we get into our breakout groups, we'll talk about this a little bit more, but we know that there's a lot of changes that occur in our staffing and our leadership and the team composition. So, the team that you have in place at the beginning of an intervention could be very different than the team that you're kind of dealing with, again, a year down the road or a year and a half down the road. And so you're having to reassess that. And also just needing to figure out whether your organization, whether your agency actually has the resources and everything in place over time to make sure that the intervention is being implemented effectively. So I'm going to turn this over to Tori and Juliana for one last piece. We just want to be able to step into just kind of considering whether or not some of these issues around implementation are in place.
Okay, so Juliana,
Yeah.
can you tell us a little bit about the process of work planning with jurisdictions and how you partner with the jurisdiction to decide when work planning can start and what the center's role is once plans are in place for an initiative?
I mean, for me, I think the key question or the key thing to address is really having the right people at the table. So I've proceeded with work planning before, a charter or working agreements was fully developed. I think that can be a bit of an ongoing process. I think you don't have to feel like it has to be totally complete. But having the right people at the table to be able to, excuse me, to dig in the data together and really begin laying out a path for implementation is really critical. And then I think, the center's role once work plans are in place for an initiative, I think the center's role is really to meet the team where they are developmentally. So if I have a team who has a new project manager or implementation lead, we may co-facilitate some of those initial meetings with them and then provide maybe more behind-the-scenes coaching support to the lead as they transition to leading meetings on their own, and then continue to be a support to them as they work their way through implementation. And of course, the center may also provide additional side-by-side support to the team through conducting data analysis together, co-creating a theory of change, sharing examples from other jurisdictions, et cetera.
Great, thanks, Juliana. Let's move on to common missteps in teaming with Will.
Okay, real quickly here, we're going to consider some of the more common missteps. So just think about these. Failing to define the decision-making authority of the team for the change effort and within the organization as a whole. Not taking the time to create the charter, and Juliana was talking a little bit about the real pros around this. Not effectively engaging stakeholders early and often, nor making time to prepare and support them for meaningful participation. Joan talked earlier about kind of the usual suspects, and there's times when we default to the usual suspects, and we may not be making sure that we've got representation of all groups that need to be there based on what the issues are, and making sure that we've got all the right voices. And then just needing to communicate more effectively. This is an area where we talked about the communication plans. We need to think about how the team needs to be communicating, but also, how the team members need to be responsible and accountable for, for receiving the communication and doing something with it. So, making decisions and making clear expectations, about what the team and what the stakeholders should be doing around communication efforts is very important. So let's talk a minute about some strategies to prevent common missteps. And Juliana talked about, going slow to go fast. So, we really recommend not skipping the chartering, not skipping the communication plan. If we take the time and effort to identify who's doing what, it will pay dividends down the road and help address issues as they surface. We need to prepare stakeholders that who may be joining the team or entering the team, and maybe coming into their first meeting with the contextual information, who may not have the information that everybody else has, especially thinking about some of those external partners. We need to be creative with ways to get stakeholder input, especially when there's pressure to solve problems quickly. You know, it may, the team may want to look at, is there a way to do some quick surveys? Is there a way to do some focus interviews or using some existing group meetings to gather information that can help move things forward? And the other thing is just thinking about trying to be as open and creative as possible, and thinking about using technology, virtual meetings, what can be done to make sure that the different stakeholders, different team members are in a place to really, you know, share their voice and have a meaningful input into the team.
We are at the end of our scheduled time, so we will be finishing this webinar shortly. Feel free to contact us using our website, capacity.childwelfare.gov/states. That's capacity.childwelfare.gov/STAPES. You can also contact us by our email address, capacityinfo@icf.com. That's capacityin@icf.com, or by our phone number, 844-222-0272. Thank you for joining us, and have a great day.